Hi, this is Michael Helfand with the second installment of No Harm, No Foul. Today we're going to continue our exploration of to what extent does American law embrace this principle of no harm, no foul, that you don't have to pay, you don't have liability in instances where you don't harm somebody. To do that, we're going to be looking at the case of the Great Onyx Cave. But before we do that, let me just recap where we're up to so far. In our first video, we considered two types of cases. One, somebody trying to take internet from a wireless network that isn't theirs. Or an instance where somebody wants to move up in a baseball stadium into a better seat that they haven't paid for. And in each instance, we asked ourselves, when you take that wireless internet or when you take that seat you haven't paid for, do you have to pay the owner for what you've used? We've talked a little bit about the ways in which you might normally be responsible to pay for something. When you agree to it via contract, I agree to pay you to mow my lawn. Or sometimes I have to pay when I punch you in the face, when I trespass on your property. In those instances, I've harmed you, and so I have to pay. But is there any other category that I have to pay for that might cover cases like when I use internet that isn't mine or take a seat that's already empty? And we noted that there's this category in the middle, unjust enrichment, restitution. These two concepts giving us the following idea. If a person is unjustly enriched at the expense of someone else, he must restore that person's property. That is, he must make restitution. When a person is unjustly enriched, he has to restore that person's property. Now, we left over here and asked, what does it mean to be unjustly enriched? What does it mean to restore a person's property? To think about these concepts, I'd like to introduce you to the case of the Great Onyx Cave, which went something like this in 1936. A fellow, Edwards, owned a cave underneath his property. And this cave was actually quite beautiful, so we're told. People would come and visit. In fact, not only would they visit, but they would actually pay admission to see this Great Onyx Cave. And Edwards made quite a lot of money off the cave. But there was one problem. Part of the cave was under Edwards' property. But part of the cave was also under his neighbor Lee's property. Now, you could only get into the cave through Edwards' property, and so Edwards would charge admission. But Lee also owned part of the cave that people would come look at. It was underneath Lee's property. There was no way into the cave through Lee's property, but still Lee owned some of the cave. And Lee brought a lawsuit claiming, you know what? I should actually be entitled to some money here. Part of this Great Onyx Cave is mine. Now let's think about this for a second. What might Edward have to pay Lee? What do we think about this type of case? Well, one way to think about it is, maybe Edwards should have to pay Lee for renting Lee's property. Well, if you think about that for a second, the answer might be Lee should get $0. I mean, how much could Lee really rent a part of the cave that you couldn't even enter? Lee had no entrance to the property. How could he rent the property? There was no market for an unenterable cave. So if we think about this in terms of, well, you know what Edwards should give Lee? Rent. The answer is going to be Edwards going to give Lee money. How much money? Well, $0, because that's how much the rent would be worth. But rent isn't the only option. Think about all those dollars that Edwards was charging people in order to get into the cave. Maybe we should say, you know what Edwards should give Lee? Edwards should give Lee some of those dollar bills. Well, here's what the Supreme Court of Kentucky said. Quote, the law in seeking an adequate remedy for the wrong has adopted profits received rather than damages sustained as a basis of recovery. Let's think about what this means. Here's what the law says. We don't think about whether or not Lee has been damaged or how much Lee has been damaged when trying to figure out what somebody like Edwards should have to give Lee. No, instead what we focus on is the profits Edwards makes, not how much he damages Lee. And if Edwards is making tons of money off of using Lee's portion of the cave, Well, then Edwards got to give Lee some of those profits received from all the admission tickets. Why should that be? Well, first the court said, the philosophy of all these decisions is that a wrongdoer shall not be permitted to make a profit from his own wrong. That's kind of a moral take. Somebody shouldn't be able to make money off of doing a wrong. But it's more than that, the court tells us. In some cases, no harm is done, and in these cases, if the sole remedy were by an action of tort, i.e., damages sustained, the wrongdoer would be allowed to profit at little or no expense. Now let's think about this for a second. Let's say the only thing American law required Edwards to give Lee would be the damages. What was Lee damaged? Well, Edwards took his property and didn't rent it, and Lee wasn't able to rent it to anybody else. So, what would the damages be? Maybe we would think about it. The damage was Lee's inability to rent the property, but we already noted that the rental value is probably $0. How can you rent property that you can't even get into? So, if all we focused on were the damages sustained, Edwards would have every incentive to make use of Lee's property in order to make tons of money off of the tickets sold. He has to pay Lee no money, or maybe very little money, and he gets to make all this money from all the tickets he sells to come see the Great Onyx Cave. That would be a real problem, wouldn't it? There would be no incentive for people like Edwards not to use other people's property to make money. And so the Kentucky Supreme Court says, we can't have that be the way in which we figure out how much Edwards has to pay Lee. No, we need a measure of damages that's going to ensure that people like Edwards don't take Lee's property. Don't use it, don't take advantage of it. What's that amount going to be? It's going to be the profits. You see, if we say to Edwards, if you use Lee's property, you're going to have to pay Lee the profits. Now Edwards has no incentive to use Lee's property. He's going to spend all this time and effort to market and tell people, come see my cave, let me use Lee's property, and then every dollar he makes, he's just going to have to give it to Lee. In this case, we don't say just because Lee didn't really get damaged, he couldn't use that cave anyway. We don't say because there was no harm, there's no foul. Not at all. What we actually do is we create a measure of damages that says, you know what? Even if you don't harm that person's property, you're going to have to pay the profits you got from that property. And what's that going to do? That's going to make you think twice before you go ahead and use somebody else's property.